Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along. It's a rather large ask, I would say, to be doing the top tips in a presentation that takes less than about 850 hours, because there's so much to know. But thank you, Gillian. As I say, we have been working with SDP, but also with lots of organisations, large and small, on public sector tendering. And every week there's more to know, which I think is why you're all here. It's quite a big challenge. I think what I would like to say before we get through to the slides is maybe just a note of encouragement. Some of you might be quite small organisations. Some of you might be just starting, and you know this is your first chance to look at the public sector as a market, or you've set up your own business. And people can be a little bit despondent sometimes and think, you know, it's just for the big guys, there's no chance, you know, it's so competitive. I have to say, we've just watched many companies and clients of ours. They've put the time in because you have to. It's a bit of an investment, but there's many of them have done their homework, taken time to go to SDP training. Tip number one, I have to say, and they have been successful. You know, they don't win every contract they go for, but some of them have beaten some of the biggest suppliers in Scotland and managed to maintain those. So if there is a sort of overall message, it's stick with it, do your homework, and the money is all there to be had. The first thing I was going to say is the public sector is quite a different market compared to what I would call a normal commercial sales process. Commercial sales, you can meet someone, you're doing your targeting, you can do plenty meetings, you can ask them to say, you know, what sort of thing are you looking for, how can we change our products to meet what you've got. Public sector's really quite different to that. I sometimes think it's a bit of a sweetie shop, so it's quite nice because all the tenders appear, they're published, but you can't engage with the clients in quite the same way. It's a very process-driven and also highly regulated, and I know that's very frustrating for everyone. So tip number one is there's a lot to learn about that process, but how you make it work for you. Meet the buyer as part of that, but obviously these are very busy events, so you don't get a whole hour with the potential buyer. So we're going to have a look through the presentation at some of the tips on trying to find the right people if you don't see them on days like this. The public sector presentation of the tenders, there's quite a lot to learn. The public sector are looking for value for money, and in general that's a mix of price and what we would call quality. So how are you actually technically going to do the job? And I would say when we first started doing tender training back in 2008, the sort of questions we were struggling with was more to do with how to answer the quality questions like methodology, who's on your team, for example, how to put together maybe your health and safety type of information. And now in the public sector, and you've seen that from the previous couple of presentations, things are very different, a lot of additional aspects to cover. Yeah, so aside from just price and quality, you're now really having to get to grips with quite a number of additional topics. So fair work, sustainability, community benefits or community wealth building, as you'll have been hearing from a lot of the presentations. Inclusion, I don't know if did anyone sit through the presentation from BASE recently? Fabulous, really sort of thought-provoking. So how do you, particularly us as suppliers, what can we be aware of to make sure that our teams are including people who are disadvantaged or disabled? Equality and diversity, ethical trading. So there's a whole range of what we would call the softer subjects that you'll now find are actually attracting quite a large score in tenders. So it's not just good enough to be good at the technical part of how you're going to deliver a project or deliver supplies. You've really got to get to grips with what's going on in the public sector in these particular areas as well. Good news, SDP does training in most of these areas, but also there are a huge number of support organisations some of them represented here today. And there's homework to be done, people to speak to get some support. And much of it is free of charge. So BASE, Zero Waste Scotland, for example, you'll get help on the SDP site, have many resources too. So Scotland, at the latest count, has over 900 buying organisations. So these are the people that we're trying to target in order to sell our goods and services or for works. And what I would say in terms of tips is not just to look for the very obvious ones. So we know about Scottish Government, we know about the councils, NHS, but in particular, if you're maybe a smaller organisation or a new start, it's probably unlikely that you're going to get a place on a very big public sector contract first off. But within those 900, there are all sorts of organisations all represented on the Public Contract Scotland portal, where you can start looking to see who's looking for the sort of services and goods that you provide. A few bits of jargon here, non-departmental public bodies. We'll have a quick look on one of the other slides how to get hold of these, but they're generally either quangos, there are people, I think I've listed some at the bottom, Scottish Canals, Scottish Qualifications Authority, Forestry and Land Scotland. So there's some of you will know them as key target audiences for you, but it's definitely worth to spend a bit of time digging in to see who's represented behind these 900, because they all have to follow the public sector rules, which means they all have to publish the tenders. So don't necessarily just only look at the larger organisations. Another one there represented actually just before we leave the slide is housing associations. Almost, I think, certainly it says here 200, certainly maybe even 250 different housing associations all across Scotland. They need furniture, they need office supplies, they need cleaners, and they also obviously need the people who deliver their core services and the whole construction and housing side as well. So quite an important market. What do they buy? We could have about another 28 slides on this, I would say. We've, I think probably with intent, I suspect we've probably worked in almost all of these areas in terms of preparing tenders for clients. I have to say the most interesting one is the one in the bottom there, Birds of Prey. We were asked to come and help a chap called Russell, who works at one of the Fife transfer stations for waste, and he takes his amazing group of birds of prey round about, and he was told that he had to tender to do his walk-around service. Russell was petrified, no idea. We sat down with him, and he told this most amazing story that, in fact, he trained all the vets in Fife and beyond because he knew so much. And we ended up putting together a really nice presentation in his tender, and he won. Highly delighted. But that's an interesting example of some of the services that now go out through procurement. There's, I would say, almost nothing at the end of the day that doesn't at some point go through a public sector body. And the challenge really is then how to use the systems and your contacts and work out how they buy these services in. So I think obviously, hopefully, everybody knows about Public Contract Scotland. I don't know, maybe just a show of hands who's registered. Excellent. In Scotland, it's quite nice and easy. South of the border, there are quite a few different portals that you maybe have to be looking at. PCS is where you're going to see all the opportunities from Scottish public sector. We have regulated contracts, so anything over 50,000 for goods and services, anything over 2 million for works, so construction, has to be published on PCS. PCS will publish a range of different notices, so if you're using it regularly, you'll start to see those. You're going to get prior information notices, really useful. So another tip, A prior information notice tells you about a procurement that's about to happen, and quite often it's put out by the buyer to advertise a meeting or some sort of market engagement. So it's worth to look. It's usually hidden somewhere at the bottom of the notice. Here's the procurement coming up, but there's a meeting, or here's a person to contact. So use these, what we call the pin notices, to get yourself in front of the buyer, and you can maybe influence. I'm trying to think a good example. So we had a client who provided materials. They did a certain type, but quite often their materials were bundled up in what we'd call a general building materials lot. So they had to go to a sort of prior meeting to try and influence to make sure that their lot was done as a separate thing. So it's those kind of lot strategies you could influence. You'll get the contract notice when the contract's live, obviously for bidding, contract awards, and you'll also, and this is very important, you'll get notices for subcontracts. So these are the tier 1 contractors. So far, usually it's dominated by construction companies and civil engineering. So a lot of the people that you'll see exhibiting here today, but they too now have to, as part of their contract, put their subcontract opportunities through PCS. So there are different types of contracts. A term contract is the kind of more straightforward one. So usually it's one organisation, you win, you've got the work, it's guaranteed, you have a budget, start, finish date, and so on. So far so good, fairly straightforward. Increasingly, however, you're going to come across something called framework contracts. I think many of you might already be looking at them. Hopefully some of you have on them. But the issue with frameworks is it's, in some ways, if you like, almost like an approved contractor list. So you get on the list, but there's no guarantee of work. So sometimes you have to work within the framework to increase your opportunities to actually get some work through. Sometimes it's on rotation. So 4 contractors win, they each get a shot in a row, so kind of what we do for our training, for SCP, for example. Or it could be a ranked framework. So, only the first place person gets the first go at all of the work, then it's the second and third. So by 4th place, potentially you're maybe not getting so much. So worth to check that, make sure you know what kind of framework you're bidding for. Something relatively new, and this again, maybe as a tip, could be quite interesting if you're quite a new bidder. A dynamic purchasing system is a form of framework, so you can bid to be on it. In general, you don't put any pricing in, so it's almost like a pre-qualification arrangement. But it gets you on a list so that when tenders come out, you automatically receive those. The important thing is, compared to a framework which is closed, this is open, so you can join at any time. So we've worked on frameworks, DPSs rather, for taxis, transport for school, early learning providers, care providers, anywhere really where the buyer needs and recognises that people come in and out of the market. So a DPS has got quite a low level threshold, if you like, to get on, but if you're starting off in bidding, maybe that's quite a good. To be honest, I often just go into Public Contract Scotland and just put DPS as a keyword, and it will bring up some examples. It's also a good thing to ask as you're going around the stands, are there any dynamic purchasing systems that I should be on? And then obviously the subcontracts we've mentioned. Aside from what you're going to see on Public Contract Scotland that's published, there is also a buying method, if you like, that's very commonly used by the public sector called quick quotes. So it is what it says. It should be quick, it should be simple. They're not always that. Occasionally a quick quote can come with quite detailed tender documents. The key issue is it's below 50,000 in terms of goods and supplies, so smaller contracts. That 50,000 might be something that's for 4 years, so in fact even smaller value again. And for works, it's anything below 2 million. Now that's actually quite a high threshold in itself as well. And the biggest challenge for us as suppliers, I think, is that the quick quotes aren't published on PCS. The only thing that's published is the actual award notice afterwards, so you're only going to find out, if you like, once it's too late. A public buyer, if they have a quick quote requirement, will put their documents together. They're going to use Public Contract Scotland to administer it. But when they come to decide which organisations they're going to invite to quote, it's absolutely up to them to decide who to send that through, and it will all come through by email. So there are rules, if you like, and good practice in amongst the public sector, but in general, they'll send it to people they know who already work for, say it's a council, for example. They might send it to people who've bid and maybe just missed out. Usually, it's recommended that they send it to one or two what I would call wild cards. So incomers in the market, people that they don't know. So today's event, for example, is your opportunity to say, I've not had a quick quote with you before, but please can you consider us for any quick quotes in, whichever area you are. So when public buyers are deciding who to invite for quick quotes, they will use Public Contract Scotland initially, and they'll look at what we call their supplier finder profile on PCS. Can I just check how many people have filled in that already, supplier finder profile? Okay, so a reasonable amount. We'll have a look at just shortly the screen where you can see that. And surprise, surprise, there's a course with Supplier Development Programme on this as well in particular. So PCS, there are different systems. Contracts Finder covers the UK, if you're interested. There's a Northern Ireland portal, Sell to Wales, another one as well. So if you're looking beyond Scotland, there are similar setups, but we'll just focus on PCS for today. So as I said, it's a national system, it's free of charge. Predominantly, it's a way through a kind of email alert system that you're going to find out about contracts that could be interesting for you. It's a bit of a bone of a contention. I think we all suffer a little bit where you put in some keywords, but you then get a little bit of a deluge of emails coming through. So we might, depending on what Q&A time we can have a chat about that. But in principle, you go in, you register, have a few keywords, and you start to receive the notices through. Some of the notices will be the subcontracts, as we've mentioned. If you're lucky and you get selected for a quick quote, that will also come through. Beware, I've missed a quick quote once nearly because it looked very like the normal notice from PCS. And it wasn't until the buyer actually phoned me and said, excuse me, have you seen your quick quote? You haven't accepted it yet, that I realised I'd actually missed it in the list of things coming through. PCS is also used by some buyers to actually run the tender submissions. So there's a post box there where you fill in all your tender documents and actually upload them and send them through to the buyer. There's another system, PCS Tender. We'll just cover a little bit shortly. So when you go on and register for PCS, there's a box called Profiles, and your company profile is just what you put in at registration. The alerts is your keywords, and you can obviously go in and out of that as much as you want to change it. And underneath that is this supplier finder profile. So anyone here that hasn't done that or hasn't looked at it, this is where you're going to find it. It's got some basic information at the top. You're also asked, you've got an opportunity to say which regions you want to go for. And then underneath is a straightforward text box, which asks you to fill in some information. Sorry, just before we leave, a button at the top, very important. If you don't press publish, you can fill in your profile and no one's actually going to see it. So lots of people have asked us to see what's happening. We've gone in and the profile's not published. So. In the company description, it's really very, very important I think you get about 4,000 characters, but you must be able to give a good account of yourself that the buyers can read and that ticks off quite quickly all the key things that a public sector buyer would like to know about you in order to invite you for a quick quote. It's not a sales brochure. I've seen some kind of real, kind of what I would call salesy, kind of, I don't know, marketing kind of content. You have to keep it quite neutral. You've absolutely tell, for example, what public sector clients you work with already, which commercial clients you've got. A straightforward explanation. It's not very easy to format it. You can more or less get bullets, but you can put headings in capital letters, but it doesn't accept images or, you know, nice fonts or anything like that. If you have any awards, that's great. Anything like innovative maybe, or you've got grant funding for certain developments is interesting too. And some sort of what I would call a sales message, but not in sales speak. You know, what is it about your organisation that is better, different, and in particular, you need to try and quantify that. So we would normally say things like, I don't know how many clients you have, X% of these clients are repeat business, so that says we're reliable. We've dealt with so many, I don't know, areas, I don't know, like things like vulnerable clients, if you're involved in, say, maybe trade services, all those kind of things that help to sort of help you rise above the rest. You'll also get a chance to put in 6 keywords, but remember you can actually put in phrases as well. It doesn't need to be a single keyword, so make the most of those 6 boxes that are there. You won't be able to read this, from the back, but it just gives you an idea of what the 4,000 characters, the size of the text that you could actually be producing. Now, if I'm a buyer, I maybe do a search for a certain, I don't know, asbestos surveys, something like that. I'll get my list of profiles will come up, but the only thing I see are the 6 keywords and then maybe the first 2 lines of the text, and then it's a read more. So the keywords are really vital. It's not the only part that's searched, but you need to make sure that they really hit the mark. I've seen dozens and dozens of supplier finder profiles that have just 1 line. Absolutely useless. I've seen keywords that have things like high value service. No use whatsoever. So really take the time, check your profile if you've already got one, and just make sure that it does what it needs to do. PCS, you're going to be using it for finding contracts, so don't just necessarily wait for the email alerts to come into your box. There's going to be the range, so we talked already about the contract notices and awards. If you're just new to the public sector, I'd be using this to try and get a feel for who's involved. So, I don't know, put in some keywords like security, whatever, it doesn't really matter too much. Keep it quite high level, and then start to look at what's coming through. Include archive notices as well, and you start to get a really good feel for who's buying the services, who's winning them, because you'll look at contract awards, for example, and you might pick up some prior information notices. There's another couple of notice types which have just recently come on board. They're not mentioned here. If you're involved in perhaps a more innovative service, not routinely that somebody's buying just now, but it's sort of at an R&D stage, public buyers can now put out a notice. One of them's called, I think it's preliminary market consultation. So you'll see it in PCS, and that's your chance to then meet the buyer or present back information on your views on a particularly new product or service. And the second type is a pre-competitive innovation notice, and that's where it's almost like a call for solutions. So the buyer doesn't quite know, they've got a problem and they want to consult people on PCS. So watch out for those as well. I'd recommend, as part of this research activity, that you look at the contracts register function on PCS, if you haven't already. That will do a search of the registers that most public bodies keep, and they're effectively big Excel spreadsheets. It's going to tell you perhaps also some of the smaller contracts that might not appear so readily in the contract awards. So this is just a quick look at the format. So you'll get the title. For some reason, it's very frustrating, it doesn't tell you who the buyer is on this. You need to go into the notice to see that. But if you click on the link, you get the details there. It'll give you the start and end dates plus any extensions. So again, another tip, I'd be going through Contracts Register and starting to put together a calendar of all the contracts that I know are coming up for renewal. Because this is the time that you can speak to the buyer in advance before anything's published. And again, possibly may get a meeting with them, it's not unheard of, or a call by phone before anything's published. Okay, when you open up the Contracts Register for an individual notice here, you'll also get at the bottom of the contract note an email address, and usually that's the person that's been handling that contract. So it's not the procurement team necessarily, it's what I would call the end user buyer. So that's invaluable. We have clients who take students in, maybe for a work placement, and they have them sitting, trawling through PCS, capturing some of these contact details. Another tip, use Find the Buyer facility on PCS. This kind of goes back to the first slide, so these 900 buyers that you kind of think they might be out there, but you don't know who they are yet. The Find a Buyer allows you to do a search by the name of the buyer, if you know that. I quite often have put in, to find some of the quangos, I use terms like Scotland, Scottish, something like that, and that brings up quite a few organisations that I'd actually never heard of that could be quite interesting in terms of some of these smaller bids that I'm looking for. There's also a facility here to search by sector, and that's going to give you a drop-down list with, I don't know if you remember that early slide, with the non-departmental public bodies, government agencies, centres of expertise. So use that sector button to do a kind of a browse, if you like, and it'll start to throw up some interesting public bodies. Once you find an organisation that you think is interesting, you click on the link and it brings you into the buyer profile. And this again can be quite a good area for some background research. You've got various tabs. I'd be looking out for the contract for future notices tab. So that's going to give me any maybe market engagement opportunities. I might be looking at contract awards to see what this organisation's given away. And there's also the Contracts Register tab for this particular buyer as well, so rather than the search across all them. PCS tender sounds very similar, but it's a totally different system. So anybody that's new to bidding in the room today, this is one which you are going to have to register for separately. It used to be used largely for some of the bigger contracts and by certain authorities, but in fact it's used in a much more widespread way now. So it's a good idea to get onto PCS tender. I always recommend, to be honest, that you, I don't know, find an opportunity, open it up. Doesn't matter if you don't bid for it, the buyer's not going to get on the phone and ask what you're doing. It's really the only way to get used to how these systems work. So the PCS tender looks a bit like this. On the right-hand side, you have your profile. So even if you're not bidding for anything, you can already go into PCS tender and start to fill in some of your background profile information. And on the left-hand side is where you come in to actually apply for the tender documents and to get into the questionnaires. The PCS tender system's based on something called, well, the software's, I think the underpinning one is Bravo Solution. I think it's now called Jaeger. I can't remember. Keep me straight. Jagger. Interestingly, that's what Balfour Beatty use as well. I've just been speaking to them. They use the Jagger system for their subcontract management, so it'll start to look familiar, I think. Again, there's a separate course on this for public contract, for supplier development programs. There's quite a lot to pick up, but the general format for the tenders is this. So you have your qualification section. That's where it's kind of backward-looking information, your insurance, all these kind of yes/no questions. You know, are you bankrupt? Have you paid your taxes? All of that. So those can be reasonably straightforward. But this is where you also get, can you give us some examples of similar work that you've done? So again, another tip, that's a huge area. It's very important. It can be an area where you can fail the qualification part. So take some time to start to pull together the profiles that you have on different types of contracts. And then the technical response, obviously, how will you do the job? So it can be a large number of questions there. And this is where you're going to start to see these questions about fair work. It's usually a standard one. Sustainability. Sustainability questions nowadays, it won't be enough just to say we've got a policy. We've seen some recently where you're actually being asked what your carbon emissions monitoring system is that you use. So again, SDP can help. And I think there is someone here, Jennifer, the net zero tool is advertised here. So that there's somebody there that can actually give, for SMEs like ourselves, can give free support for that. And just finally, on these sort of systems area, all of the systems allow a facility for asking questions. In most of them, you don't have to declare who you are. PCS, the buyer can't actually see who you are. PCST, they can, but the other people bidding won't see that it's you asking. You need to ask the questions as quickly as you can. So as soon as the documents are published, read everything and get the questions out straight away. And don't be frightened to ask questions. It's never viewed in a negative way. It's really always a positive. Okay, so maybe just a few highlights on improving your bid score. One of the things, the top tips I would say, is when you get your tender documents through, it's absolutely essential to identify what we would call the hot buttons for the client. One of the biggest dangers and the biggest things we see where people lose marks is that they've filled in all the boxes. It looks like an okay answer, but the client doesn't read the document and sort of see themselves in the answer that's there. So you've absolutely got to pick off what you think is important to the client and feed that back to them. So some of those things actually will be some of these areas that we've been talking about. So what's the client looking for community wealth building, for example? Is what they're procuring maybe part of a bigger regeneration project? You need to mention that, make reference to that as well. Net zero, what are the client, what's the buyer actually got in their strategy? Go onto the website and do a bit of research on that. Similarly with things like innovation and digitisation. So what are their expectations? Do they want me to have a CRM system? Do they have a system that we need to integrate with? So research into the actual buyer's interests. You can find out loads of different places in terms of the buyers for some of this background information. So aside from their website, there's huge amounts of information on public sector issues and agendas from these various sites here. Another top tip I would say, again, is particularly with tenders, it's quite tempting just to fill your tender full of features. And it comes over very strongly as sort of me. I'm fantastic, we're a great company, here's what we do. You've absolutely got to try and turn that around and say, well, we do this, but here's what it means for you. And this is what the so what question does. So when you're writing your tenders, go back and read them again and say, well, here's the client reading this, so what? Is it obvious what that means for them? Because you kind of know it in your head, but it's not obvious to the evaluators, perhaps. Probably, I think this in terms of sort of technical bid writing is the area that we would focus on most in training, and this is to plan your technical responses. So you'll have so many questions, it's very tempting to just jump in, say, oh yeah, here's the content we used the last time, that's really good. But you need to go back to basics, and this is almost exam technique, where you sit down with the question, you read the specification documents again, and then you start to plan, a bit like school exams, sadly. What do we need to put in here in this answer in terms of responses, but in particular evidence, what benefits, any scope for diagrams, tables, pictures, for example. Sometimes we do this literally by hand or on a whiteboard and just say, right, let's capture all the information, plan the answer, and only then would we start writing it. I think another area that's important, and that's the first bullet, is involve your frontline staff. So sometimes the person writing the bid is a little bit locked away, but all the value and all the information, all the customer intelligence is sitting with the people actually doing the job. So show them the question, say, right, well, what can you think of that we've done recently to keep to time, delivery in full, how have we met challenges, when things didn't go well, and gather as much as you can from the people on the ground. I was quite interested, this is Nature Scott, have a stand here. Another tip is you will have to answer questions about community wealth building and community benefits. And I think we've all got into a little bit of a rut now, because we all sort of start to choose the same things, so tree planting, litter picking, whatever. Take the time to sort of open up maybe your horizons a bit on some of the wider opportunities that you can cite here. This is an example of Nature Scott, the peatland action. So it's really quite a big strategic initiative. And there are lots of others like this through this type of agency where, as an organisation, you can try and find a way to link yourself through there. Volunteering is obviously a good thing. So rather than just saying community benefits, we'll do a bit of volunteering, you could link it to some of these initiatives that are really going to speak a lot more to the public sector. Just a quick mention as well on innovation again. This is a service Scotland Innovates, and it's relatively new, I think maybe just from last year, but just to raise your awareness of this. If you are in a situation where you've got some nice product development, something quite innovative, this is a way to bring this directly to the attention of the public sector as well, and you follow through to the link. The description at the bottom is one of these examples of the market consultation as well that you might start to see in PCS. Okay, and then just to finish up, you'll get all the slides obviously, but there are many, many sources of free support for the bidding process. We'll put STP at the top, unashamedly, because we've worked with them for a long time. We've seen the benefits. But we've also seen SDP grow in terms of it's not just courses and webinars. There's a whole suite of e-learning that you can just run through yourself, and a massive amount of resources as well that can be very useful. Templates, toolkits. We also do work through the Business Gateway. So depending on where you're based, Business Gateway and local authorities run expert help programs. And many of them will offer up to 3 days, for example, free consultancy. Procurement's covered, financial matters, digital media and so on. So definitely worth to contact Business Gateway as well.